All right, first classic interview of the new year. We're going to go back to my interview with James Kilgore, a former inmate who actually understands the prison system, spoke to us about the prison system. This is from September of 2015. And as I reviewed this interview to run it for you this week, especially for people who never saw it when it originally aired, I was thinking of rather than how far we've come with regard to reforming our prison system since I did this interview back in 2015. I was thinking of the opposite, how we haven't really advanced much in terms of our thinking and our sophistication and our understanding about the problems with America's prison system. So that's how I was thinking of the interview. Maybe you'll think about it the same way, maybe not. My interview with James Kilgore from September of 2015 is this week's classic interview. James Kilgore was the last fugitive member of the Symbionese Liberation Army, and he spent 6 years in prison for the murder of a Sacramento housewife during an April 1975 bank robbery. The Symbionese Liberation Army is the 1970s era group notorious for bank robberies and killings and the kidnapping of Patricia Hearst. And during his time in prison, James drafted his 3 published novels. He teaches at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and his new book is called Understanding Mass Incarceration, A People's Guide to the Key Civil Rights Struggle of Our Time. James joins me now. James, sometimes mass incarceration and the sort of mass incarceration status quo in the United States is described as a sort of experiment. Can you talk about that a little bit? In what ways is our status quo with incarceration a sort of experiment?
Well, I think it's beyond the experimental stage. It's been going on for over 30 years, and it's a qualitative change in the way in which the US government deals with not only criminal justice, but poverty more broadly. So we've seen the prison and jail population expand from less than 500,000 in 1980 to over 2.2 million today. We've seen the budgets, the amount of money that's spent on incarceration grow from about 6 billion to over 80 billion today. So I think we're beyond the experimental stage. I think it's become really part of the lay of the land. I think Brian Stevenson, the author of Just Mercy, an excellent book on this topic, has said that mass incarceration now defines us as a society. I don't think it's an experiment, unfortunately, and it's going to take a very powerful social movement and a very powerful set of policy changes in order to end this established practice.
No, I certainly agree with that. I guess I use the term experiment more in the sense that we didn't really have any data telling us that some of the sort of stated objectives of the incarceration status quo would actually reduce crime. And we were sort of being sold this bill of goods that, hey, listen, we get criminals off of the street. You prevent them from committing crimes in the future. The war on drugs, which was incredibly racially tinged, was presented as a way to sort of prevent nonviolent drug offenders and low-level drug dealers from sort of graduating to more serious crime. And didn't it fail in the sense that, in many ways, the incarceration status quo may be creating more crime than it prevents?
Absolutely. The expansion of prisons and jails has created havoc in many communities in the country. Eric Cadora has come up with the idea of $1 million blocks, where the state is spending more than $1 million on locking up people from blocks in specific neighborhoods. These are neighborhoods made up largely of poor people of color. Not only have thousands of people been taken from these communities to prisons and jails, but also the social welfare provision in those communities has been cut back. So the means of economic and social survival in those communities has been made more difficult. And to top that off, we've seen an acceleration of policing in these communities and the pouring of dollars into resources to develop SWAT squads, to arm police with M16s and armored personnel carriers and so forth. All of this has created an environment where we're much more likely to have crime, we're much more likely to be provoking arrests, and we're much more likely to have policing that looks to arrest and punish people rather than to solve community problems.
So I want to talk a little bit about some of the changes we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years. And I've talked many times on my program about how 9/11 and the sort of desire for security that it caused was successfully used to pass everything from the Patriot Act to scale up NSA surveillance, etc. You write in your book about how 9/11 was also used to intensify the war on drugs. And I think maybe people are less familiar with how that worked. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I think 9/11 contributed to the kind of internationalization of the war on drugs and blaming some of the elements of excessive drug use in the communities on what was happening in Mexico and South America. So that then also connected to an anti-immigrant policy, which we see today. And that is, since the year 2000, we've seen a tremendous increase in deportations. We've also seen criminalization of immigrants on the guise that they are likely to be bringing in drugs. But the population, for example, of Latinos in the prison system has increased by 50% since the year 2000, a much faster growth rate than any other population group. We've also set up special prisons, criminal alien prisons, which are set up specifically for people who have immigration offenses and are labeled criminals and made to do time. In many cases, even for simply crossing the border, people can do up to 10 years, even up to 20 years if they have prior arrests. Previously, when people were convicted of illegal entry, they were simply taken to the border and sent back across. Now people can do years in prison for offenses like that.
And even though private prisons make up a relatively small portion of the total number of prisons in the United States, the private prisons are disproportionately capitalizing on the detention of undocumented immigrants. And this has become a huge moneymaker, has it not?
Absolutely. The private prisons, David, have found immigration to be their market niche. So they hold only about 9% of prison beds across the country, but about 40% of the immigration detention beds. And this has become this has really salvaged them. At the turn of the century, private prisons were in very difficult financial straits. There were a number of scandals going on, but Steve Cornell, who was the head of one of the private prison companies at the time, said that after 9/11, that immigration was going to be the future of private prisons. And he's been proven correct. Not only are they building detention facilities, but they also spend a lot of time lobbying federal and state governments for harsher immigration laws in order to increase the numbers of people that are held in detention. They are also contracting for supervision of people who are awaiting immigration judicial procedures. So, for example, the BI Incorporated, which is a subset of the GEO Group, the second biggest private prison provider, they have a contract to keep 7,000 people on electronic monitors who are awaiting decisions about asylum or deportation applications. So really, immigration is their baby, and they're trying to promote harsher laws. And they also participated in advocating for the laws in Arizona, Alabama, Mississippi, and so forth that have tightened up immigration policy.
Is there an opportunity today, where we find ourselves today with regard to incarceration, to start undoing some of the elements that have contributed to what we now see? Is there anything in particular going on right now that might serve as a sort of entryway to starting to shake up what has clearly been a failed system?
I think there's a lot going on, things that we haven't seen previously. And I'd just like to mention two. The first is, at the top, we've begun to see some bipartisan discourse against mass incarceration. Mass incarceration has become a political issue. Hillary Clinton's talking about it. Newt Gingrich is talking about it. The president has talked about it. It wasn't even mentioned in the 2012 political campaign. And now across the board, you're seeing partnerships, Rand Paul joining hands with Cory Booker and so forth, to try to find ways to reduce the jail and prison population, in many instances simply because too much money was being spent on corrections to the detriment of state and local governments. But secondly, and I think more importantly, we've seen huge amounts of mass action across the country at the community level and at the national level. And I don't think we can divorce all of the activities that have taken place in response to the killings of Michael Brown and Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, and so forth from the whole system of mass incarceration and a racialized criminal justice system. And connected to that has been the resurgence of immigrant rights activities, forcing the president to modify his stance on deportation and to relieve 5 million people from immediate threat of deportation. The government's reactions to these phenomenon are largely because there's a fear that if they don't take some kind of ameliorative action, we'll end up with uprisings across the country. So I think apart from those uprisings, there's hundreds of projects and campaigns across the country against private prisons, against cash bail, against prison building, against jail building, and programs for people returning from prison, a whole host of things that are being addressed by people who are on the move in a way we've never seen before in the last 2 decades.
I'll remind you that the book is Understanding Mass Incarceration, A People's Guide to the Key Civil Rights Struggle of Our Time. We've been speaking with the book's author, James Kilgore. James, really a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks very much, David.